So the cases in our report showed how the possibility of continued indefinite detention and deportation had really detrimental effects on the mental health of prisoners. And in fact, all four of the deaths of immigration detainees in our report, immigration detainees and foreign nationals, were self-inflicted deaths. So there was a really strong link then between the hostile environment, mental health, and suicide. And three of those people were of Eastern European nationality as well. And we know how the hostile environment has a very specific impact on those people.
Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
Jessica Pandian has an MPhil in Latin American Studies from the University of Cambridge, in which she researched anti-black policing, gang violence and racial resistance across Latin America and the Caribbean. Jessica joined INQUEST at the beginning of 2021 as a researcher with specialist focus on state violence and structural racism. She now works as a policy and research officer with a broader focus. Jessica came to INQUEST from the Institute of Race Relations, where she researched the policing of black communities and black British history. She came across the work of INQUEST during her time at the Institute of Race Relations through interviewing bereaved families that had lost a relative following taser usage. She was also interested in documentary filmmaking and is an advisor to the Independent Film Trust. Welcome, Jessica.
Hi Jessica, really nice to meet you and really pleased that you could join us today. Jessica, in your biography, that tells us a little bit about what you've done, but could you say a bit more about what first interested you in Latin American studies and how this developed into examining anti-black policing and gang violence?
Yeah, definitely. I think my journey into this is a bit unusual but unique. So yeah, I'll talk to that. So I did Spanish all throughout school, loved it. Then I went to university. I did an undergrad in geography, but did an optional module in Spanish. So that module, it was more like a social science module that happened to be done in Spanish rather than learning the Spanish language, if that makes sense. Based in the context of like Latin America and Spain. Really loved that, and I realised at that time that everything I was doing sort of revolved around Latin America, because I was also dancing a lot, like salsa and bachata from the Dominican Republic. I was reading and watching a lot of Latin American things, so I decided that's what I wanted to do for my master's. And during my master's, I had the most amazing professor, Dr. Graham Daniel Willis, who is an anthropologist but focused on criminology in the context of Brazil. So his story is amazing, and his research at that time, he accompanied homicide detective unit of Sao Paulo for like 3 years, and were with them when they came across the deceased people who had been killed by police. So I became really fascinated in his work, and he introduced me to all these other anthropologists also working on police violence and racism in Brazil. And I just learned about the many different ways in which this topic could be studied, because some books he recommended to me looked at the issue through the lens of basically black genocide, the genocide of black people, and others focused on, for example, cultural resistance to police violence. So how people in Brazil were developing community theatres that mimicked the performance or theatricality of of police violence. Yeah, and I learned so much through him, and I guess the main takeaway was that, you know, the moment of the killing or the death is never the beginning or end of the story. So, you know, these police killings in Brazil, they have their roots often in, you know, slavery, and then following the death, the family still encounter violence in the way that their loved one is, you know, demonized and dehumanized, and their struggle for justice and accountability is very painful and violent in a different sort of way. So yeah, basically throughout that masters, I really decided that police violence and state violence is something that I really wanted to work in and focus on. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I love the way that you've drawn on knowledge from different areas as well. I think we get something really rich when, you know, you've taken quite a different pathway, as you said, but I think we end up with quite rich different perspectives on things when we do that. So it was great to hear about how you'd come to be looking at this area. We're going to be talking a lot today about institutional racism, and although this phrase has been around since about 1999 when it was used by Sir Macpherson in the Lawrence Report, I think there's still a lack of real understanding of what this means. Could you describe this concept for us?
Yeah. So as you say, the concept has been around for a long time, but I think that there is still a really great tendency to focus on acts of individual racism, which I think I talked about more in the press. So people have quite a good understanding of, for example, explicit racial slurs being said to another person and recognizing that as racism. But not of institutional racism, which I would describe as the embedded structures and policies of an institution that reproduce racial inequalities and worse outcomes for racialized people, which includes those individual actions. And for example, HMIP, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons, recently did a report on the experiences of black prisoners and black staff, and it's quite powerful, the testimonies at the reference of the prisoners who describe these individual acts of racism perpetrated by prison officers. But what the report doesn't go on to say, it doesn't connect the dots between all these individual acts, which is reflective of institutional racism, in our opinion. So what we try to do at INQUEST is we have all these individual cases which often evidence whereby the prison officers may have committed individual acts, but what we try and do is connect the dots to show how that is reflective of a prison which creates worse outcomes for racialized people, and how the structures of the prison themselves reproduce that inequality.
Yes, I think you're saying that I think there can be a tendency for people to look to see if there was malicious intent to deliberately put people down and oppress them, but actually there's something about within institutional racism, you're thinking about the bigger picture and how structures actually keep people in a position where they're discriminated against, even though that might not be a conscious intention to do that in the first place.
Exactly.
Thank you. Do you think public sector leaders or even the government really understand the concept of institutional racism?
I think they must do, because the definition's been around for a long time. As you said, the Macpherson report came out in 1999, and obviously since the murder of George Floyd, that concept has been really widely used. But what I would say is they understand the term, but there is not a willingness to engage with it at all. That's why we continually see them only really talking about these individual acts, which for us at INQUEST we find quite frustrating. So that's what we try and bring to the fore, I would say. And that's how we're slightly, I think, slightly different from a lot of other charities, in that we're quite radical and uncompromising in that sense. We're totally independent. We receive no, government funding, so we are definitely in a position to do that as well. Yeah.
Do you think often they have to do, state organisations like the prison service have to do mandatory training, which is around diversity and inclusion, and I wonder if enough of that content reflects ideas about structural racism, or how much more that might be focused on the more malicious kind of actions.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I would say that from INQUEST's point of view, we do see the prison in and of itself as an institution which upholds structural racism in society, in the sense that for example, it's racialized groups who are overrepresented in prison. In prison, they have worse outcomes. So we wouldn't see the answer to institutional racism in prisons as being staff training or diversity and inclusion, if that makes sense. Even if all the prison officers did perfectly reflect society, it is an institution which, by its very nature, will reproduce worse outcomes.
Yeah, it sounds like you're saying that might be a bit of a wasted endeavour, and we're better off looking at policy and strategy that underpins in the first place.
Exactly, taking that broader look into why we have prisons in society is where we try and focus our energies on.
Thank you. After working for the Institute of Race Relations, you went to work for INQUEST. Can you tell us a bit about the work of the organisation? You've mentioned already it's quite radical, and why it seemed a natural next step for you.
Yeah, so I mean, there was a bit before I started working at the Institute of Race Relations, which is that I'd only studied state violence and racism in the context of like Latin America and America. So I wanted to learn about it in the context of the UK, because I hadn't at school, hadn't at university. So that's why I started volunteering with the Institute of Race Relations. So yeah, I was volunteering with them, and then whilst I was there was this, there were like 3 really contentious uses of taser used against black men. One of them, Jordan Walker Brown, he was paralysed from the waist down after being tasered. Another one, he was a father, and he'd been tasered in front of his son, and the son was obviously very traumatised. And the third one, it was the rapper Wretch 32's father, who was 62 years old, who had been tasered in his home. So I decided, like, oh my god, this is really, there's obviously something happening here. No one's writing about it. So I wanted to write about those 3 cases. And it grew into a bigger piece than I had imagined. And through writing that piece, I got in touch with INQUEST to talk to the families of Mark Cole and Adrian McDonald, who had both died following the use of taser. And actually both families are amazing. They put together a campaign called End Taser Torture. And through talking to those families, I came across the work of INQUEST and came to learn more about them and follow their work. And it just so happened that, well, not just so happened, following the murder of George Floyd, they had this job opening for someone to work in structural racism and state violence, which was just a really natural, perfect opening for me, and really natural progression, I guess. So yeah, and that's how I came to work at INQUEST.
Thanks, Jessica. We came across your work through an article you wrote in The Guardian, together with Deborah Coles, also of INQUEST. The title of the article was, "In Britain, a jail sentence is often a death sentence. What is going on in our prisons?" So what did you mean by that?
Yeah, well, from our work, we see how many deaths occur in prisons. In my report, we evidence that from 2015 to 2022, 2,220 people died in prisons, which is just extortionate. So from our point of view, we see how prisons expose people in prison to death, and how it contributes towards preventable and premature deaths. So, for example, a case included in a report which I recently wrote, Niall Dillon, he was a 22-year-old man, and he died of asthma in prison, and we think that's very unlikely to have happened outside prison. It's just the very nature of the prison, which has extremely rudimentary healthcare. The systemic neglect contributed to that death. Same with Winston Augustine, who didn't receive, food for 48 hours in prison, and then died in a state of ketoacidosis, which is suggestive of starvation. These cases really exemplify how the prison is a deathly environment for people. Yeah, that's what we meant.
So in particular, highlighting the area of risk, particularly for most vulnerable, and also, as you describe it, racialised people.
Definitely, but I think also the fact that even if you're not considered a vulnerable person, if you don't have pre-existing vulnerabilities, the prison can very easily induce and engender that, because of the poor state of mental health care, physical health care, and that embedded neglect. So anybody entering prison will be exposed to those, to the harm and violence that environment creates.
Thank you. So obviously the Guardian article you wrote was really based upon and referring to the major report which you and INQUEST had completed. It was called Deaths of Racialised People in Prison 2015 to 2022, Challenging Racism and Discrimination. And in the report, and I've mentioned just now, you used the word racialised frequently. Can you say precisely what you mean by that?
Yeah, so we took a lot of time and care to come and decide on that word. But to say that this report was quite unique in the sense that we included so many different groups in the report. So we included Black and mixed race people, Asian and mixed race people, people of Eastern European background, white Gypsy and Irish traveller people, white Irish people. So because we had such a large group, we wanted a term that best reflected all of them. And we chose racialised because it signifies, one, people who have been subject to racism, and two, because the definition for racialised people, which I have here because it's slightly long, is because it refers to this complex process of racialization, which is the process through which societies construct races as real, different, and unequal in ways that matter to economic, political, and social life. And in this definition, it excludes white British people because although they can also be racialized, historically in society they've had the power to racialize others. So yeah, there's my slightly complicated answer, but that's why we decided to use that term, and that's what it means.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad I asked the question because it is quite a complex term. There's a lot of meaning wrapped up in that particular word, isn't there? Definitely.
Yeah, a lot to consider, but yeah.
Thank you. So how did you conduct the research for the report? Was it easy to access the information you needed?
Mixed. So we did a lot of different, we engaged in a lot of sort of different research methodologies for this. The first thing that we did was that we gathered 22 of our own cases on the death of racialized people in prison. So we already had that information, and we had access to the families, and we wrote out the summaries of the deaths, and we got the quotes from the families. So that bit was relatively comprehensive because we had all that information. And related to that, we then looked across all these 22 deaths and analysed what were the underlying cross-cutting issues across those deaths, to draw out those institutional issues relating to the prison. So that was the first thing. The second thing was difficult because we wanted to get data from the government about all the people who had died in prison, information on them relating to their ethnicity, nationality, gender, age. That was not publicly available. There was no ethnicity breakdown. So what we had to do was file numerous freedom of information requests to the Ministry of Justice and obtain that data. We had to engage in some negotiations with them. So that part wasn't easy at all, but we did manage to get it in the end, which means that we have the first available public breakdown of about deaths in prison. And the third thing that we did was we analysed all the post-death investigations relating to the 22 deaths. So this included inquest reports, prevention of future death reports, and prison and probation ombudsman fatal incident reports, to see whether either the race of the person was addressed or whether the potential role of racism in the death had been addressed. So those were our three main research methodologies.
Why do you think that information wasn't so freely available? I mean, it seems like pretty standard information that you would expect to be in the public domain. So I feel quite incredulous that wasn't easily available to you.
Exactly, and we felt exactly the same way, that it definitely should be there, and that's one of the recommendations that we make. We shouldn't have had to have gone through that process. Anybody should be able to access it. But this is something that we encounter a lot in our work, that the data that we think should be publicly available is not. You have to put in a lot of effort to be able to get there. You have to engage with a lot of experts to be able to access that information, often through freedom of information requests. But for the public, it's not really doable. It's made very difficult. So this is something else that we think is reflective of the government's unwillingness to engage seriously in the issues that we're talking about, and to deflect attention away.
This is extraordinary, considering that many prison staff spend hours completing reports and filling in tick boxes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So often reports about prisons can make staff seem harsh and uncaring, and yet we've both worked with colleagues who are both caring and dedicated. Do you think that having fresh eyes like yours enables you to see things that we maybe have become accustomed to and don't notice so much?
I think it's a really interesting question. So I guess there's two parts to it. So the first part is that, I hadn't really spent dedicated time working in prisons before doing this report. So when I did first learn of these cases, I was really shocked to see what I saw. For example, I mentioned Winston Augustine, who died essentially in a state of starvation. Another case, Annabella Landsberg, who's a mixed race black woman, she was restrained in her segregation cell, after which she was just lying on the floor for 21 hours, and people, healthcare staff and prison staff knew that, but they didn't help her, and actually one nurse threw water over her and didn't help her, so that was particularly shocking. But again, what I would say that now, having worked in this area for a little bit longer, these instances of neglect we see across all cases. So it's not something exceptional to specific cases, and that's something we see as reflective of the prison culture and the prison environment as a whole. And that even, for example, we understand that there are people who are compassionate and do go in with good intentions, but that rarely is able to surface or contribute in a meaningful way because of the way in which a prison is a sort of dehumanizing and demeaning institution to people inside. So an example of that is the death of Jordan Hullock, who was a 19-year-old who died in 2015 of meningitis, and his condition had been worsening for some time, over days. And there was one prison nurse who really went against the grain of everyone else and really was trying to help him, bringing him water and food and paying closer attention to him. But despite her efforts, she was not able to save him, and he died. So yeah, I guess my point being that even if you have compassionate individuals in the system, it's difficult in an institution which in and of itself is not compassionate. So it's sort of an oxymoron. What we campaign for is a more compassionate society, in the sense that to reduce the idea that we need prisons and the criminal justice system and society to pay more attention to developing healthcare and education and being more compassionate to individuals before they have to enter the criminal justice system.
Yeah, I think you're highlighting some really excellent points about our attitude towards people who break the law more generally, and whether there might be more compassionate ways to manage them. I'm just thinking about some of those instances of staff being compassionate, and I think sometimes people might sit back on knowing that they're being compassionate in their role, but there's something, I'm guessing with the individual that threw water on the woman that you referred to, that other staff were aware of that, and whether there's a challenging of people that behave in less humane, less compassionate ways, that's just as important as being compassionate yourself, isn't it? So what were the main findings of your research, Jess?
Yeah, so we had 3 main findings. If I just refer to them quickly because they're quite long. So as I said, we did an analysis of the 22 deaths, and we found 7 key cross-cutting issues across their deaths. So I'll just go over them briefly now. So the first one was the inappropriate use of segregation, and this was predominantly an issue in the deaths of black and mixed race people. So often people were not assessed at all, or they were assessed very poorly before being put in segregation. Whilst in segregation, their mental health was not assessed, and what often ended up happening was a serious decline in their mental health. The second one was racial stereotyping, again mostly an issue in the deaths of black and mixed race people. So they were often stereotyped as aggressive, as non-compliant, and as challenging. So they were seen as a discipline and control problem. And racial stereotyping in and of itself had its own ramifications. So this often justified inhumane treatment, disciplinary treatment, and often it gave rise to a culture of disbelief. So that case that I just mentioned of Annabella Landsberg, she was frequently described as challenging, which is why she got placed into segregation. probably linked to the use of restraint against her, how she got waterfalled on her, etc. Thirdly, we have the hostile environment. So the Home Office's inherently discriminatory hostile environment policy encourages the continued detention and deportation of foreign nationals. So the cases in our report showed how the possibility of continued indefinite detention and deportation had really detrimental effects on the mental health of prisoners. And in fact, all 4 of the deaths of immigration detainees in our report, immigration detainees and foreign nationals, were self-inflicted deaths. So there was a really strong link then between the hostile environment, mental health, and suicide. And 3 of those people were of Eastern European nationality as well. And we know how the hostile environment has a very specific impact on those people. The 3 and 4 were the neglect of physical and mental health, and these were seen across most of the cases. I think regarding health, the neglect of physical health, that was mostly seen amongst Black and Asian prisoners, and often what would happen is that their families would call in, other prison staff would alert the prison to the issue of someone's deteriorating health, but it just wouldn't be acted on, and it would worsen to the point of no return. And it would be exacerbated by inadequate healthcare in prison, more generally. Mental health, there was, again, across the cases, there was a really strong link between mental health and suicide, primarily amongst people of Eastern European nationality and Black people. In the 5th point was that there was a failure to respond to warning signs. So, for example, there are emergency cell bells in prison which should be responded to within 5 minutes, and often they wouldn't be responded to at all, or they'd be responded to with severe delays, which contributed to deaths. Also, there would be times when prison officers would look into cells and see that they wouldn't get any response from the person, but still wouldn't act on that, and there'd be serious delays, and then eventually they'd go in and the person would not be responsive. Again, mostly an issue amongst Black and mixed race people. And then lastly, we have bullying and victimization, and the 3 cases that we have in the report were Black and mixed race people, and 2 of the men who were bullied took their own life, whilst another was killed by another prisoner. So these are really severe instances of bullying and victimization. Those were the main findings of the cases. Then the data is slightly more complex to understand. So with deaths in police, we see disproportionate numbers of Black and racialized people dying in police custody. It's not the same in prison, and we think that this could be due to the makeup of the prison, in the sense that older prisoners tend to be mostly white, and then younger prisoners tend to be mostly Black and minority ethnic prisoners. So whilst there aren't disproportionate numbers of Black and racialized people dying in prison, what we did learn was that there were that people of Eastern European nationality and white and Gypsy Irish people, for example, had really high rates of self-inflicted deaths, especially compared to white prisoners. And that was a key finding. And we also saw how every racialized group died at younger ages compared to the white group. Again, this could be reflective of the makeup of different demographics in prison, but we thought it was quite an important finding. And then lastly, with regards to our analysis of post-death investigations, we found that none of the investigations related to the 22 deaths addressed whether racism was potentially a role in any of the deaths, and that was particularly that was quite a hard-hitting finding, because the 22 deaths that we featured in the report definitely do evidence racism. They're really shocking cases, so we thought that spoke, in and of itself, that said quite a lot. So yeah, those were the main findings.
Thank you. That's quite shocking. Quite shocking to hear that hadn't even been picked up as a theme, and perhaps there's something about society generally and its understanding of race. But what recommendations did you come to as a consequence of your findings?
So, as I said before, we did make one recommendation, that the government should publish all the data on prison deaths so that it is publicly available. The first recommendation that we issued was that we wanted the specific issues in the deaths of racialized people to be addressed by the Ministry of Justice, the Department of Health and Social Care and Government, and we wanted those relevant government bodies to develop a detailed action plan to address those distinct issues. Unfortunately, we haven't heard of any progress on that, but we think it's really important. Thirdly, we wanted all these post-death investigations to meaningfully consider the potential role of racism or discrimination in the death, and we think that is so important because it could lead to the prevention of future deaths, and we need to be able to evidence it and see how these issues surface across different deaths in order to prevent them. In fourth place, so this is an ongoing campaign we have to establish the national oversight mechanism, because at present all of the recommendations made, for example, in INQUEST reports and prevention of future death reports, are not followed up on, and there's nothing to hold these bodies accountable to make sure that they do implement those recommendations. So the National Oversight Mechanism would be able to then do that. They would be an independent body tasked with the duty to collate, analyse and monitor learning and implementation arising out of post-death investigations and inquiries. And the last recommendation we have is broader, and I think I've spoken to this a bit beforehand, but we call it transformative social change. So as I said, the decision to imprison the 22 racialized people featured in the report ended up being a death sentence. We see imprisonment as ineffective in reducing crime and violence in society, and we see it as perpetuating harm and violence, with marginalized groups worse affected. So what we would like to see is the halting of prison building, which at the moment, the prison population has increased so much, and there are plans to increase it even further. We'd like to decrease investment in the prison and in prisons and the criminal justice system more broadly, and redirect those resources into education, health, welfare, housing, education and social care, which would, address the root causes of violence in our society.
Thank you. I find myself becoming more depressed as the longer we go on in this conversation, Jess, because you're describing really a whole system which is under-functioning, and there may be reasons for that, and where the culture is corrupted to the point of being lacking in compassion, to the point of being cruel, and then which furthermore doesn't have a properly and effective investigation system which can operate in a sort of independent process. All very depressing.
Sorry about that, yes, but that is the state of affairs.
Yes. So one of the most disturbing comments in your report came from the sister of one of your selected examples, Tariq, when she describes the lack of empathy and compassion coming from a health professional. Do you think there is something about working in a prison that saps people's capacity for compassion?
Yes, I imagine so, because as I've said, it's an institution which, dehumanises and demeans by its very nature. It's set up on the logics of punitivism, not to care for people, and to be an institution in which people thrive. So because of that, even if you go in with good intentions, I think, as I've said, either it won't surface or materialise, or the prison environment will mean that you don't see those people in prison with compassion or as humans. And I would say that, related to what I said before, that our vision at INQUEST is not to have a prison filled with, for example, compassionate workers, because we believe it to be an oxymoron. What we'd rather have is not have prisons and the criminal justice system, not be so overly reliant on them, and instead to have that compassion in society, so that people wouldn't even have to go into prison, so that you have those healthcare and the education and the social care set up, so that people could live full and meaningful lives outside. I think, and Angela Davis said it as well. Prisons, they don't disappear social problems; they disappear, human beings. It's not an answer for the poverty and inequality that we see. Yeah.
Thank you. So, this particular example we were referring to is about a healthcare professional. Do you think this might reflect the double whammy of institutional racism in the NHS operating within the prison system?
Well, yes, I would say, we have institutional racism built into most of our institutions, prison, policing, healthcare. So yes, most definitely. And her brother Mohammed, he also died in a state of starvation and alone, and neglect was a part of that. It's just a really terrible death, actually. So yeah, and all these institutions, they are linked, and they speak to the structural racism embedded in our society, and also, I think, of the way in which our society is so dependent on these punitive ideals, especially with this government that we have now. We're looking to become even more reliant on the criminal justice system. So yeah, in each of these cases, it speaks to society as a whole, and just shows where everything's gone wrong, because it's never just one issue in prison. If you look at the whole lives, even before they go into prison, you see so many issues that they face outside of prison.
Shared David's kind of experience of, this is a really depressing subject to focus, and actually I think thinking about imprisonment generally is pretty depressing, because I think anyone who starts looking at it knows that prison doesn't really work to address any kind of dysfunction, and can often amplify difficulties. So I think digging into this subject, where that's probably particularly prominent, feels really quite depressing. How do you manage to look after your own well-being and keep yourself going, feeling resourced and nourished, doing the kind of work that you're doing, Jess?
I feel really privileged to be able to do the work that I do, but I would say that in terms of keeping myself, not super depressed, because the work is depressing. I really enjoy artistic work, delving into the more creative sphere to address the same issues, but in a really different sort of way. So I really enjoy. I'm making my own short film at the moment. I really enjoy editing, and I write film reviews. I watch a lot of film. So I think that's one way in which that's my sort of happy place. I really enjoy that. Because the work we do at INQUEST, it's very direct, it's very full on, but it's really beautiful to be able to engage with the same sort of topics, but from that creative perspective. Like I watched a film actually the other day. It's called Surge. It's really amazing. It's basically about a man in mental health crisis in London, and it really spoke to a lot of the cases that I've seen, in the sense that you see the police intervening rather than like a mental health professional, but it was done so artistically and beautifully, and the acting was just amazing. So yeah, I enjoy that part of it, I think. And at INQUEST we have our 40th anniversary coming up, so we are doing some artistic projects ourselves there, which I've been lucky enough to be involved with. But apart from that, I've just joined the gym. That's helped. Been doing my Zumba. Yeah, it's definitely a balance, and I think you're always working to adjust it. But yeah, that's what I'd say.
Thank you. It's really nice to hear about the use of creative endeavour, because I think creativity is kind of the counteraction to the corrosiveness of the work that you're engaged in, but obviously really, really important work to be doing, and making a huge contribution to our understanding of what's wrong with society. So thanks very much, Jess. Really enjoyed the conversation with you, if not the subject matter itself.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed talking to you both as well.
Thanks very much indeed, Jess. Like Naomi said, very challenging but very informative and interesting conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.